Hi there, the purpose of this video is to introduce you to the TWS Reading Lesson Plan assignment. This is one of the big assignments for this class, and the purpose of this assignment is to, first of all, just give you practice using a TWS lesson plan to introduce you to that type of format, which you may already be familiar with from previous classes, depending on the sequence you're taking them in. That will help prepare you then for student teaching, where you will submit a lesson plan using the same type of structure. A couple lesson plans actually as part of your unit plan. The other goal of this is to give you a brief lesson on how to plan a successful reading lesson plan. So we're going to come back to these best practices in this presentation, but first I want to show you the assignment sheet and sort of familiarize you with the overall assignment concept. So here on Classroom, you can find all the information about the lesson plan here. You will find the assignment sheet as well as a few different versions of the TWS template. So this is the blank template on which you can type your own lesson plan. It will be typed into the template. This version has tips in the comments, so on the walkthrough video, you'll see I refer to some of the tips in the comments, so you can view those as well. This one is also editable, so if you prefer to use the tips and comments version, you can, and you can resolve those comments or keep them on as you're working. Eventually, you'll resolve them when you turn it in. And then this one is the sample one, so you can see in red it's sort of filled out so you know how much would go into each section, what each section of the lesson plan template might include or look like. So let's take a look first at the assignment sheet. There's the justification here. Please take some time to read that. There are also some reminders here, sort of guidelines for going about planning this. So one important thing is this is one lesson, okay? So in other words, it's basically you're thinking about one day, although a reading lesson plan needs time within it to read the text too. So it's probably going to span 2 days. So on day one of your lesson plan, you're going to do your pre-reading, any introductory lessons that you need to give. For example, you might want to include a couple key facts about the writer, the author, a couple key facts about, the culture from whence the text came, something like that. So any introductory information is going to come on day one. Your pre-reading strategy is going to come on day one, and then you're going to begin the reading on day one as well. So you're going to introduce the during reading strategy, you're going to get students started on the reading together, and then you may have them finish it up for homework, or maybe on day two you're going to finish it up as a class, and then day two would include the after reading activity. It's really important for this one. We are doing a 2-day thing here, so 2-day at tops, because you're going to continue into day two to wrap it up, since you have to have time for students to read the text. So you are not doing like a large project as a part of this, or a large paper. So as part of your lesson plan, you should not include an essay. You should not include a project or a large presentation. Instead, you're going to choose a strategy to use after reading that maybe helps your class have a good discussion. So maybe sort of, if you do KWL, you talk about that, and then you talk about the text, and then you do an exit ticket, okay? So sort of think of whatever the assessment for this is a formative assessment or a small checkup, not a large test, not a quiz, not a paper. Those are the ends of units, not the ends of short lessons that would fall within the unit. So we are going to think of this lesson as housed within a larger unit rather than needing its own large summative assessment, okay? So one reminder here is we always start with reading comprehension and just appreciating the text. So I don't want you to only focus on objectives and strategies. I want you to always leave some time in especially the after reading, but just like, okay, what happened? What did you guys think of this? What surprised you about this? How can we connect this to our own experience? Those types of questions are actually probably even more important than standards-based questions, or at least they're more important as like the starting point. You can't talk about theme unless you know your students understand what happened in the story in the first place. You can't talk about figurative language unless your students understand how the story ended first, right? So you always start with like, what happened here? And what did you all think of it? What were your responses? We have to leave space for that in every single reading lesson plan. I would argue, I think Gallagher and Tavani would argue as well, right? So that is, we always have to leave room for that within our discussions. We also want to always think about purpose. We've been reading about purpose this week and from Gallagher as well. You think about why you want students to read this. So, if I look at The World on the Turtle's Back, the Native American creation story, why would I assign this to students? Well, there's a couple things. I want them to gain understanding of other cultures and their tales and their mythologies. I want them to appreciate other cultures. I want them to be able to relate other cultures maybe to origin stories they're more familiar with. But I also want them to read to get better at comprehension, to make predictions. So those sort of big picture stuff, but also skills-based stuff are part of the purposes for reading. We also, of course, want to think about strategies. So as a requirement, something I'm definitely looking for is that each reading lesson plan has a before reading strategy, a during reading strategy, and an after reading strategy, because of everything we've learned about how using these types of strategies increase student comprehension. And that should be sort of the primary goal of giving students anything to read, is to make them a better reader, right? And there's a lot of sub ways of making them a better reader, like making predictions, finding theme, all of those things, right? Essentially boil down to, we want students to be better readers. And we know from what we've learned so far that if we want that to happen, we have to be intentional with using strategies that support comprehension. Your lesson plan will also include at least one form of formative assessment. And if you're using a strategy, you've got formative assessment going on probably anyways. But if you include like a graphic organizer, you want to build that graphic organizer and include it as part of your lesson plan. Totally okay to find a graphic organizer online and modify it as long as it fits the purpose you have established for the text. We need to keep sort of everything unified with that purpose that you've chosen. If you have them write a little paragraph that you intend to score, you need to create a scoring guide. It doesn't have to be a huge rubric, but it might say, in your responses, I'm looking for evidence that you understand theme, 2 quotes from the text. Check, check, right? You got your points because it's a formative assessment. So anything you plan to collect for points, you need to have a plan for that. Have the artifact if there's an artifact, or the instructions if there's instructions, and then at least a brief description of quality indicators or a scoring guide. And finally, the reminder here, you will not be creating a large assessment or a summative assessment. You might have a graphic organizer, a quick writing, a short paragraph, or you could assess in discussion, even without artifacts. If you choose to discuss, though, you need to have a plan for how you're going to assess every single student as part of that discussion, which is very difficult to do, and we haven't really talked about discussions and how to have good discussions yet at this point in the course. So discussion is a great formative assessment, but how are you going to assess each and every student? I would say probably have a good class discussion and then have students jot down a couple ideas as some sort of exit ticket that you can collect for every student. Highly recommend an exit ticket as the final thing you collect as part of your lesson plan. There's some FAQs here too, like, can I use something I found online? Can I use something I did in another class? Can I incorporate strategies mentioned by other students in the class? So take some time to read through those as well, okay? So there is posted already a TWS walkthrough video that walks you through the template in detail. Other videos are coming soon, such as how to make objectives out of standards, how to write the actual lesson plan part of your overall lesson plan, where you say what steps to include. So those more specific breakdown videos are coming soon, but definitely now take some time to look through the lesson plan structure. And you might even want to pause here to watch the walkthrough video before we talk about how to actually plan the lesson. So that way you have a sense of what goes into that template, what the template looks like, all the different component parts of the template before we continue here. So it's a great place to pause and come back to this later. Okay, so this section of the presentation, we're going to talk about how to plan a good reading lesson plan. So keep in mind, anytime you're asking students to read a text, and that includes a loose definition of reading, because we have this expanded definition of literacy, right? So Even if you're asking them to watch a TED Talk, we consider that reading a text, right? If you're asking them to analyze a film, that's reading a text. So anytime you're asking students you're giving them a text and you're asking them to read it, the lesson plan is a reading lesson plan, okay? So we have some best practices. Number 1, use backwards design, and we're gonna talk about that throughout this. Number 2, make sure to establish a purpose. Anytime you hand students a text, they need to know why you are handing it to them, why you see value in it, what you want them to get out of it. So, and that should be explicit. It should be explicit. It should be on the board. It should be something you say. Basically, you're like a salesman. Here is this text. It's super cool because of the way the author does this. We're going to read it to help us understand how good writers do blah, 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 blah. Or we're going to really work on our ability to visualize as we read. It's a super important skill, and this text is going to help us do that. As we do it, we're going to annotate, blah, 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 right? So that should be clear and explicit to students. We don't keep secrets about why we're giving texts to students. Number 3, we always want to incorporate intentional comprehension support before, during, and after. Number 4, we want to maintain unity as much as possible. This is difficult in a reading lesson plan because there's tons of things to talk about. We always talk about the characters and why they did what they did. We always talk about the theme and the message. But the main activities you choose, the main strategies you choose should all be related to the objectives and the goals that you have. If your main goal is about a theme, you want your pre-reading to somehow be related to theme, ideally. You want your during reading to be something that will help students figure out the theme. And then after reading, your discussion, you're going to talk about other things. You're going to talk about characters. You're going to talk about language. But you want to focus mainly on theme in your final activities. You want your exit ticket probably to be related to theme. Okay, so we want that unity throughout the lesson plan. Even if we go in other directions, we want to maintain that focus. And number 5, another reminder to prioritize space for comprehension, response, and connection. Before students can analyze theme, they have to understand what happened in the story. So if it's a really complex story, theme comes later. First, you talk about what's going on, what happened, what's he saying, right? What's the author, he or she or they, saying in the text, okay? So just some things, best practices to keep in mind. Now let's talk more about backwards design. Whoopsie, my graphic obscured the rest of this. Backwards Desi. So the backwards design process you may have been exposed to before, but refresh, reminders are good. If this is the first time you're learning about it, cool and fantastic. Backwards design is basically beginning with the ending in mind. So when we plan a lesson, we don't actually start, okay, what's the first thing I got to do in this lesson plan? Instead, you want to think about the end. So the first step is really to identify the desired results. That's connected to that purpose for reading. Why am I giving students this text? And after while students are reading, what are we working on here? What's the skill or the big picture literacy goal that we're working on? So skill would be something like we're going to get better at identifying themes. The big picture thing would be I want students to appreciate how we see cultural differences in writing styles. Or I really want students to get a better understanding of the Puritan era. So those might be big picture things. I want students to be able to connect their own experiences to this text. The skills-based things are like identify theme, identify figurative language, analyze how figurative language makes a text cool. So you'll have some different types of desired results. So we start there with that sense of purpose. And then you want to think, okay, how will I know if they've gotten that? How will I know if they have gotten better at identifying theme as a result of reading and talking about this text? And that's going to be a product, usually, right? So yeah, formative assessment, I'm going to walk around and look, I'm going to listen to their discussions, but maybe an exit ticket, right? Since eventually on the test, they'll demonstrate that, but what's the checkpoint I'm going to include with this lesson plan? Every lesson plan should have some type of checkpoint. And then which learning activities can I include that lead students to successful completion of that checkpoint or success on that final exam at the end of the unit? That includes your strategies. So which before strategies can I use that will support students' ability to identify theme? What during reading strategies can I use that will support students' ability to identify theme? What after reading strategy can I use that will support students' ability to develop theme? Do you hear that unity? I'm focusing on theme as much as possible in all of my choices. If theme is my main objective or my main goal that I want students to get from or practice on reading as we're doing this. So that intentionality is really important. Here's another look at backwards design with some examples. So this is a science type example, but if our learning outcome is understand the molecular structure and function of cell membranes, we then have an objective. So the learning goal is sort of the overall standard. The objective is, in student-friendly language, predict the ability of a given molecule to travel through a membrane. Remember, coming soon is a little video on how to turn a standard into a set of objectives. So maybe we know on the final exam for this that there's going to be this question here. So how can I support that? What activities can I choose that support their ability to complete that? What activities can I choose that support their ability to complete that assessment? They're going to read the textbook. I'm going to have a mini lecture. I'm going to do a homework assignment. They're going to do this, right? So different activities all along the way that ensure that they will be able to complete that assessment effectively. Now, for the purposes of this, yeah, there's a big exam coming, but remember, we want formative checks all along the way before we get to the test. Sometimes we say you should pretty much be able to predict how each student will do on the test because the formative assessments you've done along the way, you already know whether they've gotten those skills or not, right? So maybe a formative assessment is, as part of this particular lesson plan, I'm going to have an exit ticket related to this, right? To check whether they've got it before the big test comes up. And then I really like this orange column because this is the question that you want to ask yourself as you're planning each step of the lesson plan. Does this activity, does this pre-reading help students achieve the learning outcome and the goal? Will it help them do the assessment successfully? Will it help them predict the ability of a molecule? Will it help them understand the molecular structure? If not, you want to reevaluate. You want to choose something that's a little more unified and more likely to support the learning that you want to see. Now, keep in mind, with English, some of the questions that you ask are not going to directly relate. They will still support comprehension, though. So if you ask, okay, what happened in Act 2? That's actually, indirectly related to their understanding of theme, but supporting comprehension always comes first in reading. So then for this last, right, choosing activities and alignment, we're going to include before, during, and after reading strategies that support comprehension, but also ideally support whatever learning goal we have. So we want to choose before, during, and after. This is where all the work you've done over the past few weeks is going to come in handy because you're familiar with a couple before reading strategies, and one of them that you chose to focus on might work really well. Or maybe one that you learned about from another student, or a different activity from Gallagher or Tovani might work really well. Maybe one of the graphic organizers you took a look at during reading is going to work really well. You can modify it and sort of make it your own. Maybe you want to do a timeline thing. Maybe you want to do a chart. So you want to use what you've learned so far. Some of these back pocket strategies might come in really handy. I'll give you an example now of how I would use the backwards design process to plan a reading lesson on Coyote and the Buffalo. So this is a Native American trickster tale, which you may be familiar with the genre, and it's a really fun story and pretty easy for students to read, most students to read, because it's not quite like 11th or 12th grade reading level. So it's a really fun text to use in the classroom because it's not super complex in its vocabulary, so you can get to analysis a little quicker because students tend to understand the plot. So what do I want students to know? How do I see if they've learned it? And then how can I structure the lesson to make sure to lead them into that learning? So I'm going to start from the end with what I want them to be able to do. So I'm going to call it a goal because it's just from my own brain, right? I really want them to be able to read this story and figure out the theme and then talk about how that theme is a commentary on human nature and whether they agree with that or not, okay? So that's my goal. Here's the standard that relates to it. Using appropriate text, determine 2 or more themes in a text, analyze their development throughout the text, and relate the themes to human nature and the world. So that's straight from the MLS standards. From there, I craft objectives. So quick preview of how to craft objectives. I like stair-stepped objectives. So what that means is from each standard, if you break down the standard into what students need to be able to do first before they get to the more complex things, like for example, analyze and relate are much more complex learning on Bloom's taxonomy than determine or identify theme, right? So I like them to be stair-stepped with the most simple skill leading us towards the most complex skill. So I think before students can determine a theme, they need to understand what a theme is. So my first objective is define. And that's pretty common. Define or identify as the first objective because those are lower order thinking tasks that can lead us to completion of the higher order thinking tasks. So students will be able to define theme. From there, I want them to be able to analyze the characters in a text and use that to identify a theme. So I've got now analyze and identify. So those become a little bit more complex. And then finally, relate a text theme to their own understanding of human nature. So that's going to require making connections, synthesizing sort of their own experience with the text. So that's much more complex as a skill. I like 2 to 3 objectives for each standard, beginning with lower order on Bloom's and working towards more complex. Again, there's a video lesson all about that coming soon, but that's sort of a preview for you. So I've got my objectives, right? That's the first step, what I want the students to be able to know and do. From there, I have to think, okay, well, how will I know if they've done those things, right? So, and for the purposes of a reading lesson, you will have a formative assessment and or a quick checkup assignment. So what might that look like? For define theme, maybe during the intro lesson, as part of my introduction to the text, I want to review what theme means, and I might include a little formative assessment as part of that to make sure they understand the definition before we go, to make sure every single student can define theme before we start to try to figure out what a theme is. I don't know what that's going to look like yet at this point, but I know I need some sort of formative assessment to do that. Then, okay, so how will I know if they can analyze characters in a text to identify a theme? Well, as they read, I think I want a graphic organizer that includes something about what the character's choices are, what the consequences of those choices are, and then we're going to use that to talk about theme as a whole class. I want to sort of have them compare what they wrote on the charts. So I'm going to say formative assessment through the graphic organizer and then the discussion, and that's how I'm going to check their understanding for that. And then finally, relate a text theme to their own understanding of human nature. We're going to discuss that as a class, but I think I want to collect an exit ticket where I ask them to do that in sort of a short, informal paragraph writing. And then I'll just be able to review that, and then we'll talk about that sort of the next day. And we'll continue on with that in the next text as well. So I basically did a think aloud for you, right? So sort of thinking through how I would collect evidence that they had achieved the objectives or at least gotten better, right? It's not always about attaining perfection, but are they getting practice in this? Are they getting the hang of it as we go? So from there, then I'm going to choose more specific strategies. So I know I want to teach theme. I'm going to include a mini lesson on theme. The formative assessment I'm going to collect is going to be, maybe we're going to do a little, what's that? That quizzy thing where students on their phones, they push the button and then they can see where they all are, right? Maybe something like that would be good. For here, I know I need a graphic organizer. That's going to be my during reading strategy. And I'm going to craft some discussion questions that will help take us from character to theme. And then here I'm going to craft an exit ticket. And for after reading, I'm going to do a little bit of the exit ticket strategy. So from there, I choose my specific learning activities, okay? So that was just sort of a think through of how I would go about this process, and hopefully that will help you begin to craft your lesson plan, or at least think of how you might go about it. Remember too, the template that is posted for your before reading mini lesson. So this template is going to come in handy as well. Pre-reading purpose, what strategy are you going to use? You've got to teach the strategy and then transition in independent reading. And then the during reading template too, right? You're going to name the strategy, graphic organizer. So all of those templates can help you plan what will go into your lesson. So this was a long one. Hopefully you had a chance to pause and take a break in the middle of it, but really important stuff, since this is not only an assignment for our class, but it's going to apply to your student teaching experience as well. So let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, it's time to get started thinking through how you're going to use backwards design to make your lessons effective. Bye.